Somewhere inside the computer you're watching this on, there is memory, RAM. It is so ordinary that nobody thinks about it. But in 1999, the price you paid for it, down to the penny, had already been decided in a hotel conference room by a handful of men who should have been competitors. This is the story of how they fixed it, how they got caught, and where the money actually went. Dynamic Random Access Memory, DRAM. It is not glamorous, it doesn't have a logo, it doesn't have a keynote presentation. It is a small, flat rectangle of silicon that temporarily holds the data a computer is actively using. Without it, nothing runs. With it, nobody gives it a second thought. By the late 1990s, DRAM had become one of the most produced objects on the planet. Every desktop PC, every laptop, every server in every data center required it. The personal computer boom had turned this unremarkable component into a global industry worth tens of billions of dollars a year. And like any commodity produced at massive scale, DRAM was subject to brutal price competition. Chipmakers would overproduce, prices would crater, profits would collapse, factories would idle. The cycle was vicious. Executives at the major manufacturers watched their margins evaporate quarter after quarter. In a competitive market, that is simply how commodities work. Oversupply drives prices down, consumers benefit. It is, in theory, the system working exactly as intended. But some of the men running these companies had a different theory, and somewhere around 1998 and 1999, they decided to stop competing on price and start coordinating it instead. The cartel did not assemble in a shadowy back room with a single dramatic handshake. It built itself incrementally, the way most conspiracies do, through a series of small decisions that each felt in the moment like a reasonable response to a difficult situation. The major players were the giants of the memory industry. Samsung, the South Korean conglomerate whose chip division was one of the largest on Earth. Hynix, then known as Hyundai Electronics, another Korean powerhouse. Infineon, the German semiconductor firm spun out of Siemens. And Micron Technology, the American company based in Boise, Idaho, though Micron's role would turn out to be rather different from the others. Beginning in roughly 1999, mid-level and senior executives from these companies began meeting in hotel conference rooms, golf courses, and restaurants, primarily across Asia, Seoul, Tokyo, and various international industry gatherings. The stated purpose, when there was a stated purpose, was market intelligence, discussion of industry trends, the sort of thing that sounds innocuous until you examine what was actually being exchanged. What was being exchanged was pricing, specifically the price that each company intended to charge its largest customers, the computer manufacturers, for DRAM in the coming weeks and months. The executives called these exchanges the matrix. They compared numbers, they aligned, they agreed. And then they went home and charged those prices. The effect was direct and measurable. When DRAM supply was rising and prices should have fallen, they didn't fall as far. When manufacturers like Dell, HP, and Apple came to negotiate bulk contracts, they were negotiating against a market that had quietly been put on rails. To understand how much money was at stake, you have to understand who was buying DRAM in volume at the end of the 1990s. The PC industry was in the middle of the biggest consumer boom it had ever seen. The year 2000 was approaching, and corporations worldwide were replacing aging hardware. Home computers were becoming genuinely affordable for the first time. Millions of machines were being assembled and sold every quarter. Each one needed memory. The major purchasers, Dell, Compaq, HP, Apple, Gateway, and dozens of others, were buying DRAM by the hundreds of millions of dollars worth. For them, component pricing was a constant negotiation. Shaving $1 per module across 1 million units was the difference between a profitable quarter and a difficult one. When the cartel fixed prices, those savings disappeared. The overcharge, the gap between what a competitive market would have produced and what the cartel actually charged, flowed directly from the computer manufacturers and ultimately from the consumers who bought those computers to the chip makers. The Department of Justice would later characterize the affected commerce at over $700 million in criminal fines alone. Those fines represented only a fraction of the total commerce touched by the cartel. Civil suits brought by computer makers and eventually by states on behalf of consumers would push the total damages picture far higher, into the billions of dollars. Every person who bought a computer in the early 2000s likely paid more than they should have. The extra money was invisible inside the sticker price of a machine, but it was there. Cartels are inherently unstable. They require every participant to trust every other participant to hold the line on pricing, even when undercutting that price would win a massive contract. The temptation to cheat is always present, and cheating, when discovered, breeds paranoia. The DRAM cartel began to fracture in the early 2000s, and its undoing came from inside. Micron Technology, the American company based in Boise, eventually cooperated with federal investigators and provided evidence against its former cartel partners. This cooperation, under the Department of Justice's Corporate Leniency Program, is precisely what the program was designed to produce. Companies that self-report antitrust violations and cooperate fully can receive immunity from criminal prosecution. The incentive is straightforward: be first through the door or face what comes through the door after. Micron came through the door. The evidence it brought with it was substantial enough to anchor one of the largest criminal antitrust prosecutions in American history. The DOJ's Antitrust Division, working alongside the FBI, began building its case. Investigators subpoenaed records, interviewed witnesses, and traced the meeting circuit that the cartel had assembled over years. The picture that emerged was detailed and documented, not a matter of inference, but of paper trails, travel records, and eventually the testimony of the participants themselves. The guilty pleas came in sequence, and each one was larger than the last. Infineon Technologies pleaded guilty in 2004, agreeing to pay a fine of $160 million, at the time, the second largest criminal antitrust fine ever imposed in the United States. 3 Infineon executives also pleaded guilty individually and received prison sentences. One of them served 8 months in a U.S. federal correctional facility, the first foreign national to serve prison time on a U.S. antitrust conviction. Hynix Semiconductor pleaded guilty and agreed to pay $185 million in fines. Samsung, the largest player in the global DRAM market, pleaded guilty in 2005 and agreed to pay $300 million. It was, at that moment, the largest single criminal antitrust fine in American history. The total criminal fines from the DRAM investigation exceeded $700 million. That figure does not include the civil litigation that followed, the lawsuits filed by computer manufacturers who had overpaid, or the class action cases filed by state attorneys general on behalf of individual consumers. Those proceedings added hundreds of millions more and dragged on for years afterward. For the executives who served prison time, the experience was a clear signal that the Department of Justice intended to treat price fixing not as a regulatory infraction, but as a crime against real people. The prison sentences, short by some standards, were nonetheless unprecedented in the antitrust world. They sent a message that had not previously been sent with such clarity. It is worth pausing to understand exactly how this worked, because price fixing at this level is not a crude operation. It requires coordination, verification, and enforcement. The DRAM cartel used what the DOJ filings described as bilateral and multilateral meetings, often timed around legitimate industry conferences. The cover of a genuine trade gathering provided plausible deniability for travel and scheduling. Executives could justify their presence at the same hotel in the same city without raising questions. Once together, they compared pricing structures, specifically the price they each intended to charge OEM customers, the large manufacturers who assembled computers. They negotiated alignment. If one company was planning to drop prices to win a contract, another might agree to match, or the first might be persuaded to hold. The system required constant maintenance because DRAM prices moved frequently. The antitrust laws that this violated, principally the Sherman Antitrust Act, are not new. They date to 1890. The act makes it a federal crime to restrain trade through conspiracy. It does not require proof of harm in each individual transaction. The agreement itself is the crime. What made the DRAM prosecution notable was the international scope. The cartel spanned multiple continents, multiple currencies, multiple corporate cultures. The DOJ had to coordinate with competition authorities in Europe, South Korea, and Japan. The cooperation of those foreign regulators and the eventual cooperation of the companies themselves made prosecution possible in a way it might not have been a decade earlier. So, the question this channel exists to answer: where did the money actually go? The overcharge, the excess price extracted from computer makers and ultimately from consumers over the life of the cartel, flowed in the first instance to the chipmakers' revenue lines. It padded earnings reports. It stabilized margins during a period of volatile commodity pricing. It funded executive compensation that was tied to those earnings. In a narrow sense, it kept several large companies more profitable than they had any right to be in a genuinely competitive market. Then the DOJ came for it. The $700 million in criminal fines went to the United States Treasury. The civil settlements that followed paid to computer manufacturers and, through class actions, to consumers, redistributed some fraction of the overcharge back toward those who had been harmed. Individual consumers who had purchased computers during the affected period were often eligible for small settlements, sometimes only a few dollars, depending on the state and the case. The sums were modest at the individual level because the original overcharge was diffuse, spread invisibly across millions of machines. Some of the money was simply gone. Legal fees on all sides consumed an enormous amount. Years of litigation generated costs that benefited no one except the attorneys. The executives who served prison time did not serve long, but they served, and that in the accounting of this story is the line that separates this case from most corporate misconduct. The money moved, some of it moved back, and some people who thought they were beyond consequence discovered that they were not. Price fixing is sometimes treated as a victimless abstraction, a few percentage points on a supply chain that nobody outside a boardroom would understand. The DRAM case is a clean rebuttal to that idea. The victims were anyone who bought a computer between 1999 and 2002. That was, quite literally, the world. So here is the question I want to leave with you. If you had been an executive at one of these companies, watching competitors coordinate while your margins collapsed, knowing the risk, knowing it was illegal, would you have joined the cartel or walked away from the table?